Welcome to the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, October the 30th, 2020. My name is Pam, and let's begin with our first article. As college grads flee the GOP, political diploma divides grow, by Simon Montlake. 4 years ago, Donald Trump's path to the White House ran through Rust Belt states with higher than average numbers of white voters with college degrees. That strategy paid off, seeding a narrative of a working class revolt from the red, led by a billionaire Republican who is seeking to turn out those voters again on November the 3rd. But what also happened in 2016 now looks arguably more significant. College educated voters who once leaned Republican swung hard to the Democrats, including voters in suburban districts who then helped flip the House of the Representatives in 2018. The polarization among white voters by educational levels has since grown wider, putting more pressure on Republicans to turn out non-college educated white voters, a demographic that is shrinking within an increasingly diverse and educated electorate. To gain a second term, President Trump likely needs to get even more of these voters to the polls, as well as win back some disaffected college grads. The diploma divide in U.S. politics predates Mr. Trump, but like many partisan fault lines from gender to religion, it has gaped wider under his presidency, sending into hyperdrive a decades-long realignment of the Democratic and Republican parties. These shifting partisan coalitions, in turn, are scrambling everything from long-standing party policy positions to traditional advantages and disadvantages when it comes to campaign cash and the electoral map. This divide has also reshaped political coalitions in European democracies. Populist right-wing politicians have won over working-class communities that used to vote reliably for center-left parties, which are now more oriented towards more affluent and educated voters. In multi-party systems like the Netherlands, college graduates make up the base of the Green parties. In 2016, the United Kingdom's Brexit referendum slashed across party lines as less educated voters choose to leave the European Union, against the wishes of college graduates. Last year's election saw Boris Johnson, leader of the pro-Brexit Conservatives, flip dozens of seats in England's equivalent of the Rust Belt, while center-left Labour held on to university towns. In the United States, education is a proxy for class in a society that aspires to be classless. In fact, some non-college educated white voters, who made up 42% of the electorate in 2016, are relatively affluent, which is why researchers control for income when studying their voting patterns. By that measure, Mr. Trump's popularity among the white workers' class is less impressive than the myth. They made up 31% of votes he received, a similar share to Mitt Romney, a more traditional Republican, in 2012. Where Mr. Trump did better, however, was in attracting votes from non-college educated white people with higher incomes, a factor that many pollsters missed in tracking the 2016 race. These increasing margins reflect how culture issues like same-sex marriage and race relations, as much as pocketbook concerns, shape voters' behavior, says Alan Abramowitz, a political scientist at Emory University who studies polarization. Education is a stronger predictor than income because it correlates with your underlying values, he said. They've definitely lost me. Growing up in a conservative white household outside Atlanta, Brendan Pace absorbed the values of his family and its well-off community. The idea of supporting the Democrats or anyone liberal was ridiculed, he said. In 2016, Mr. Pace, by then a college undergraduate in Virginia, cast his first ballot. I thought of myself as a Republican, and I voted for Trump in 2016, he says ruefully. Since then, he shifted left, to the dismay of his family, and recently cast an absentee ballot for Joe Biden. Mr. Pace, who is now in his first year at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia, says he's unhappy with Mr. Trump's presidency and how Republican lawmakers fell in line behind him. And while he says he may consider voting again for the party in the future, for now, they've definitely lost me. For this election cycle, Polls show Republicans holding college-educated white people in Georgia, while losing this demographic to the Democrats in battleground states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. Among white voters with college degrees, Mr. Trump runs up large margins in states like Texas and North Carolina. Non-white voters overwhelmingly tilt Democratic. While Mr. Trump's crossover appeal has been exaggerated, white working class voters also helped put George W. Bush into office. He did flip some Democrat strongholds in 2016, including Johnston, Rhode Island, where Democrats dominate local and state politics. Stephanie Moravchik, a social historian at Claremont McKenna College, studied Johnston and two other Trump voting districts in Iowa and Kentucky that otherwise rarely or never voted for Republicans for her co-written book, Trump's Democrats. In all three places, most voters are white without college degrees. In Johnston, self-identified Republicans were so thin on the ground, says Ms. Moravchik, that when a Trump surrogate was proposed for an election debate in 2016, Democratic Mayor Joe Polisena didn't recognize the name. And he knows everyone in town. I mean everyone, she says. Yet in many ways, Democratic officials like Mr. Polisena share some stylistic similarities with Mr. Trump's brash nationalist candidacy, says Ms. Moravchik, who calls it boss politics. That type of politics holds a certain appeal to non-college educated voters, particularly men who respect toughness over formality. Local bosses promise to take care of their supporters and help them out, and expect loyalty in return. So, Trump seemed familiar to people in these areas, she said. Since 2016, Republicans have built an electoral base in Johnston, even as voters remain loyal to local Democrats like Mr. Polisena, a former state senator. Now they're watching Fox News, says Ms. Moravchik. Still, these GOP conversions are swimming against the general Democratic tide, in which non-college educated white voters are a declining portion of the electorate. Analysts calculate that the president needs to increase their overall turnout by 5 percentage points from 2016 simply to offset this decline, as well as win a larger share of their votes. If you're writing off white college graduates and non-whites, you're appealing to a shrinking share of electorates, says Mr. Abramowitz, referring to the Republican base. Brian Hearn, a tax attorney who lives in an affluent town outside Boston, is a fiscal and judicial conservative who voted twice against former President Barack Obama. I don't like big government, and I don't think the government does anything well, he says. In 2012, he voted enthusiastically for Mr. Romney, a former Massachusetts governor, but he didn't support Mr. Trump and has been appalled by his chaotic leadership and how it's warped the Republican Party. It's like a cult following, he says. I think he's destroyed the party's image. Mr. Hearn said he won't vote for Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump, though he hopes Mr. Trump will lose and the fever will break, encouraging Republicans to steer back to a politics that plays down cultural divisions. Our politics keep getting ramped up to extreme levels, he says. A new high. A generation ago, college graduates like Mr. Hearn split fairly evenly in voting behavior. In 1996, Republican voters were more likely than Democrats to have a 4-year degree, according to a Pew study of party identification. Today, college graduates make up 41% of Democrats compared with 30% of Republicans. In 2016, the diploma divide among white voters hit a new high, with Mr. Trump's opponent Hillary Clinton winning a higher margin of college-educated white voters than Mr. Obama in 2012. The divide was even higher among more affluent voters, a trend that has since been accelerated. This narrows the path to victory not only for Mr. Trump, but also for vulnerable down-ballot Republicans. It also has had a significant effect on campaign fundraising, according to a recent analysis by the New York Times. Mr. Biden outraised Mr. Trump $478 million to $104 million in zip codes, where 2/3 or more of the population were college graduates, primarily on the coasts. In the rest of the country, meanwhile, Mr. Trump outpaced Mr. Biden by 630 million to 591 million. But the divide also risks defining the party as a vehicle of metropolitan elites and non-whites that has lost touch with less educated white voters. Over the past 4 years, the party has moved further left on issues like climate change and LGBTQ rights, making it harder to bridge the gap with traditional Democrats in places like Johnston. Liberal donors also tend to push these priorities. If they want to be the party of the working class, they have to include the white working class, who are still a majority of the working class, says Ms. Moravicek. Still, Democrats see themselves as carrying the New Deal torch and governing for less advantaged, notes Thomas Patterson, a professor of government at Harvard. Even if their coalition doesn't look like it, their philosophy tips it, he says. That gives the party a chance at retaining or even growing some of their working class support. He's more skeptical that the Republicans can close their education gap by wooing back disenchanted managerial and business-oriented Republicans. The base is more symbolically and culturally oriented, he said. That's going to make it hard for the two to get together because they care about different things. Our next article, An Electrician's Good Deed Launches a Movement of Helpers, by Anna Tarnow. Woodburn, Massachusetts. For years, a pale blue craftsman-style house in need of some tender, loving care stood quietly hidden away behind a curtain of overgrowth in this Boston suburb. Then John Kinney arrived. When a shower of sparks rained down from the light in her kitchen ceiling in early August, blowing out electricity on the first floor, a neighbor referred her owner, Gloria Scott, to Mr. Kinney, an electrician. It was a wiring problem, he figured, not uncommon in an older house like hers. He got the lights back on and waived the cost of his quick fix. Mr. Kinney could have left it at that, knowing he had helped out someone with an immediate problem. But he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen, a home in need of many repairs to meet minimal safety standards. Maintenance of the home Miss Scott inherited from her parents had gotten away from the retired executive assistant over the past 10 years. She had holes in the ceiling, extensive plumbing damage, and electrical issues. Mr. Kinney says, I know it was tough. So that day I told her, hey, I live 5 minutes away. If you need any help, just call me. I will be here. He added matter-of-factly, I knew she wasn't going to call me, so I just had to come back. With a network of skilled colleagues, Mr. Kinney realized he was perfectly positioned to help. He returned and told her that he could triage the worst of the problems at no cost to her. I kept saying, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? Miss Scott says. Mr. Kinney was quite sure. A network kicked into gear. Work began with a small, close group of volunteers as Mr. Kinney recorded their progress with his smartphone. When he posted the video online, he was encouraged by the positive response it drew. Hoping to find donors to help with the few $1,000s he thought would be necessary for materials, Mr. Kinney started an online fundraiser with a tagline, Nice Old Lady Needs Help, along with a Gloria's Gladiator Facebook group. To his surprise, these efforts took off. The fundraiser received more than $111,000 and more than 16,000 people joined the Gladiators group. What started off as a project to just repair a few holes in Gloria's kitchen ceiling has spiraled into a movement where she's basically getting her whole house rebuilt, says Mr. McKinney, who found himself coordinating on a massive scale. My phone rings nonstop, night and day, he says. Volunteers began bringing trays of food each day, and several local companies donated time and resources to the renovation. People just kept showing up, Miss Scott says, sometimes as many 20 volunteers a day, but she adds, John was very good at shielding me. For Miss Scott, who values her privacy, the sudden influx of attention took getting used to, but she says she realizes that the volunteers also derive a sense of purpose by following Mr. Kinney's example. I don't know how I was blessed with John being the person that came to my rescue, she says. Somebody was watching over me to connect me, and I will always be indebted to him for what he started. Now, only a few months into the project, The Gladiators have transformed this two-story house. The battered roof, which once allowed animals easy access into the attic, is decked and shingled. Plumbing that spewed hot water has been replaced. Fresh drywall has been installed in the kitchen and bathroom, and new insulation fortifies the interior against the northeastern winter. The backyard is refreshed with bright green sod and the beginning of a new patio, along with a shored up septic access cover. And out front, with the overgrown bushes cleared, the blue house now proudly shows its face to the world. "It's pretty cool," says the neighbor Karen Spinoza, who recommended Mr. Kinney's service to Miss Scott. "You get up in the morning, you open your blinds, and it's like turning on the TV to watch HGTV, you know? Let's see what's going on today." One good deed seeds many more. At the house, Miss Scott sits in a rocking chair on her front path, greeting visitors who arrive steadily throughout the day. Her chihuahua, Choo Choo, darts inquisitively in and out of the open front door. "Everybody knows they have to say good morning to Choo Choo," she says fondly, "and they have to say good night, too." The volunteers are pleased to oblige, and they move purposefully on to their tasks. In fact, progress is faster than on a regular job site, says Mr. Kitty, attributing it to the enthusiasm of those donating their time. Rick Calouette, a contractor volunteer, agrees. "It's been very interesting to see how many people really care and have put themselves out there to come and help and volunteer. It's just awesome, you know. It's a good thing." The project energy is spreading beyond Woburn, too. On the Gloria's Gladiator Facebook page, members post pictures of other projects they volunteered on or request help for their own restoration projects. "We see other chapters popping up around the country now, and it's just been incredible to witness," says Mr. Kinney. And he did believe anyone can follow his footsteps, whether the kind deed is big or small. "All I did was get the ball rolling and call attention to something, and anybody can do that." Once Miss Scott's house is completed, Mr. Kinney hopes to continue with similar projects. "We're trying to find the right avenue to further word," he says. "At this point, it's gotten bigger than myself. The goal is just to keep the kindness spreading." While there are nonprofit organizations that offer house repair for older adults, coordinated community support networks play a key role in helping people remain in their homes, even if the idea of needing assistance is uncomfortable or awkward, says Laura Reiser, a research manager at the Royal Small Town Studies program at the University of Northern British Columbia. "It's all about changing the community dialogue," says Ms. Reiser, who studies informal support networks for older adults. "It really takes a very special coordinator and even special leadership in a community to make it okay to talk about support systems." Fostering intergenerational contact and encouraging early conversations about aging is important in that process, Ms. Reiser says. More importantly, she adds, it's essential to remember that the internet is not accessible to many older adults, so purposeful outreach with analog contact lists of trusted community members and organizations who can help out is important. "It's really about just getting everyone to understand that it's okay to just support people aging in their community," she said. "And if people accept help, it doesn't devalue their purpose or their sense of worth at all." For Kinney, it's action that matters. A good neighbor, he says, is observant and is going to recognize when somebody needs help and acts on it. You know, it doesn't take much. Just go in and take the initiative. Our next article, in Shift to Green Energy, A Matter of When, Not If, by Ned Temko. In London, it was a moment of high drama in the final debate of the American presidential campaign. The accusations by President Donald Trump that Democratic candidate Joe Biden's climate change proposals would destroy the oil industry in the United States. And while Mr. Biden is actually proposing only to cut federal subsidies for oil and transition to cleaner energy sources, President Trump clearly hopes the issue will resonate with industry-dependent voters in key states like Pennsylvania, Texas, and Ohio. But no matter who wins the November 3rd election, their dispute could end up proving academic. Evans, as a candidate, sparred key voices in the wider world. Governments and corporate leaders, analysts, and investors have been asking a different question. Not whether there will be a major move away from high carbon energy sources like oil, but when. A full-scale shift is probably many years away, if only given the likelihood of continuing demand for oil in developing economies, as well as for industries like petrochemicals. Yet the timetable seems to be accelerated, and the overall directional of travel towards lower carbon energy sources is unmistakable. Growing consumer awareness and activism around climate change is one major catalyst, but there are new drivers as well, above all the economic shock from COVID-19 pandemic. The modeling is changing. The picture is made strikingly clear in the latest annual report by the International Energy Agency called the World Energy Outlook 2020 and published this month. It sets out 4 alternative scenarios, tracing not just the implications of various climate policy changes, but the huge economic effect of the pandemic. All its models foresee an increasingly dominant role for solar energy in generating electricity and a steady decline for coal. The importance of wind turbines is also projected to increase. The report does expect a post-pandemic rebound in demand for oil, but even under its most conservative scenario, a fairly rapid economic recovery and no major new climate change policy initiatives, demand is projected to level off in the 2030s. The report adds that the fall in oil demand and price during the pandemic has been focusing the minds of investors and governments in oil-dependent countries on the longer-term need to diversify. That message has already hit home in many developed countries, and as governments prepare huge packages of investments, subsidies, and incentives to restart their economies, cleaner energy sources like solar, wind, and hydrogen are getting a closer look. A number of countries have already mandated a shift away from selling new gasoline-powered automobiles in favor of electric vehicles. The 27-member European Union, with its nearly 900 billion recovery plan, has pledged to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Britain has made the same pledge. With revenues from North Sea oil fields on the wane, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has expressed his hopes to sow the seeds windswept waters with energy turbines and make the country the Saudi Arabia of wind. China, the world's second largest economy and largest carbon emitter, has announced it will become net zero by 2060. How such pledges are turned into action remains to be seen. China continues to commission old-style coal power stations and provide them as part of its Belt and Road infrastructure deals with countries across Asia and Africa. But just as Xi Jinping's government has sought to stake out a major place in high tech, it may well be seeking a leading role in a greener world energy economy. China already makes most of the world's solar panels. Business is changing too. The business world seems to be changing as well. The auto industry is a prime example, nowhere more so than in Germany. Top manufacturers there at first shrugged off the prospect of a wide-scale move into electric cars. Now, galvanized by the success of America's Tesla, they're scrambling. The German government has also announced a major investment in a national network of charging points. Japan's Honda recently announced it is getting out of the Formula One engine business. The stated reason? To focus on new electric car engine technologies in response to what the company called a once-in-a-100-year period of great transformation. In Australia, still a major coal exporter, the government is backing a new power station project in a western desert area, a green hydrogen complex where the world's largest solar and wind energy farm would power the production of a carbon-free hydrogen for export to Asia. Signs of change are even appearing in the oil industry. In Europe, France's Total, Royal Dutch Shell, and BP have announced plans to begin transitioning from reliance on oil and invest in low-carbon energy sources. The American take? American companies are still betting on oil and gas remaining by far the world's main source of energy, while hoping to address climate change concerns through mitigating technologies like the capture and storage of carbon emissions. Since natural gas seems likely to remain in high demand as economic transitions to clearer energy, there are no major signs yet of European-style diversification. Nor has there been any sign of a major move away from an increasingly controversial source of U.S. oil and gas, hydraulic fracturing or fracking of shale rock. Mr. Trump has made that an election issue as well. For while Mr. Biden has made it clear he's not going to try to end fracking, he would ban new sites on federal land. Yet the huge expansion of fracking in recent years, making America energy independent and opening up new export markets, was achieved through large-scale speculative investment and borrowing against the promise of long-term profit. That hasn't materialized. So it may turn out that, like the energy mix changes gathering pace elsewhere in the world, the future of fracking could be decided less by politics than by new market forces. Over time, we may see a major geopolitical shift as the world's 20th century focuses on access to oil supplies in regions like the Middle East give way to new kinds of competition for the technologies, resources, and equipment needed to power a cleaner energy economy. Well, my dear friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, October 30th, 2020. My name is PM. Please stay in and stay safe. You be greatly blessed today and do what you can do to make today a great day.